I started to wonder if he's always been there, in all the movies, not just Puss in Boots, but in all the movies. Even if he's behind me on a daily basis when I'm procrastinating life, he waits. He's there. Death in the movie Puss in Boots The Last Wish is not about Puss in Boots, it's about the viewer. There's a moment in Puss in Boots The Last Wish that doesn't feel like a kid's movie moment at all. It's not loud, it's not flashy, it's just a whistle. And suddenly, you feel goosebumps and everything changes. And if you've ever felt your stomach drop during the scenes with death, it's not because death is scary. It's because death was written to target something so intrinsic to humans that anyone can relate to it. Our avoidance of reality and accountability for time. Death is not the villain in this movie, at least on surface. He's just the truth. Let's talk about why it works and why it hits closer to home than most antagonists ever do. Most villains want something. Power, control, revenge, validation. But death? No. Death does not want anything from Puss. He doesn't bargain, he doesn't escalate, he doesn't even chase. Not really. Robert McKee, in Story, talks about the most powerful antagonistic forces being immutable pressures, forces that do not change, but force change in the protagonist. The greatest pressure in Story comes from what cannot be negotiated. And that's the key difference. Death has no arc. He doesn't change, he doesn't learn. And that's exactly why he's terrifying. In storytelling terms, this is powerful because the most frightening antagonists aren't those that grow stronger, but those that stay constant. Death is inevitable. The tension does not come from him changing. It comes from watching Puss slowly realize that he's the one that he has to change. It's just like any other movie where some calamity happens that's inevitable, but eventually the heroes manage to stop the calamity. No. In our case, the hero needs to change for the calamity to not happen. And this twist hits hard. Here's something that we realize though, from the moments when we actually start to know death. He's not wrong. If he's not wrong, we can't really hate him or pin him down as something that needs stopping. We resonate with him, and that makes things even more impactful. He doesn't appear randomly. He doesn't hunt Puss for existing. He shows up when Puss wastes his lives, when life becomes disposable, when consequences stop mattering. This is subtle and intentional. Death isn't punishing Puss for living recklessly. He's confronting him for not taking life seriously. And that distinction matters, because cruelty would be killing without reason. Precision is showing up exactly when denial peaks. And that's why death does not feel like a monster. It feels like something you need to be aware of, a boundary. Cron, in Wired for Stories, says that the brain tracks meaning before plot. Death isn't scary because he might kill Puss. He's scary because he exposes a lie Puss has been living with. And once a misbelief cracks, the story accelerates. And this is how the movie quietly turns the camera on us. Most of us don't live like Puss, we don't burn through 9 lives. But we do delay things, we do assume there's time, we do treat meaning like something we'll get to later. That's what death represents, in case we didn't already know based on our day-to-day experiences. Not dying, but running out of excuses. That's why the whistle works. It's not loud, it doesn't rush, it doesn't explain itself. It just reminds us that things end, whether we're ready or not. This is one of the smartest design choices in the film. Death is visually restrained, emotionally distant, and orally dominant. Jonathan Gottschall, in The Storytelling Animal, explains that the human brain fills in threat faster when sensory information is incomplete. Ambiguity activates imagination, and imagination amplifies fear. The whistle works because it arrives before death does. It has no clear source, and it doesn't explain itself. Sound without image forces the viewer to participate. Your brain starts asking, is it close? Is it watching? Is it time? This turns death into a shared psychological experience, not just a character. The fear isn't on screen, it's happening inside you. Even when death is visible, he's emotionally faceless. Jungian psychology, often referenced indirectly in narrative theory. Faceless or emotionally neutral figures allow projection. We fear what we can't read. Death doesn't emote, he doesn't explain, he doesn't justify. That neutrality lets the viewer project their own anxiety onto him. Well, maybe he just hits home because I'm a fully anxious person, but I guess I can't really face that now, can I? This is why death feels personal. You're not afraid of his intentions, you're afraid of what he reminds you of. Joseph Campbell describes many antagonists not as enemies, but as guardians of thresholds. Death fits this archetype perfectly. He doesn't block the hero arbitrarily, he appears exactly at the moment where denial must end. In mythic terms, death is not a dragon. Death is the boundary. He's the embodiment of you cannot pass unchanged. That's why death doesn't chase Puss endlessly. He waits, because waiting is part of the test. Death doesn't want to win. It's as if it's aware of some omnipresent code that it has to obey. Death is not trying to defeat Puss, he's trying to be acknowledged. Think about this when you look at the final confrontation. Death doesn't disappear because Puss overpowers him, because he didn't. He disappeared because Puss finally changed. For the first time in the entire series of movies, Puss fights to protect something, values connection, and chooses meaning over bravado. Death doesn't step back because he lost, because he didn't, but because his job is done. And this is a very important thing. The conflict is not dealt with because one side loses, but because they adjust to the new reality. And this is why Death, as a constant, still stays in my imagination. He was not evil, he was an inevitable truth that me, as well as a theoretically real person, need to be aware of. And the truth that Death keeps emphasizing is that he's not an enemy, not even close. He's the condition that gives life weight. Most villains externalize conflict. They represent something outside us. Outcasts, a parallel truth, a riot, or conflict. Death doesn't. He doesn't care. He's got a quest. And once the quest is fulfilled, off to the next target. Pretty much like the original Death from Supernatural. You could even argue that making a movie from Death's side could actually make sense and make Death the hero. He needs to stand his ground against the challenges that come at him, people that try to avoid his direction. We're looking at McKee again in story. The final act resolves the characters in a contradiction. Puss doesn't beat Death, he accepts what Death represents. And that's why Death steps back. In Campbell's terms, the hero doesn't conquer the threshold guardian, he's transformed by it. Death doesn't live because he's defeated, he lives because Puss finally takes life seriously. Gottschall argues that stories act as mental rehearsal for real fears. Death lingers because he doesn't resolve cleanly, he doesn't moralize, he doesn't disappear completely. The movie ends, but the villain doesn't die, he just went back to the background, waiting for his moment. And that's why people keep talking about him. That's why Death is such a memorable aspect to be illustrated in movies. You've done right. Not because he's cool, although this one was. Not because he's violent, although this one was. But because he forces the same question again and again and again until the answer fits. And that's just amazing to think about. The question never changes, but your answer has to. And that's how we address our lives as well. Death just exists, calmly, patiently, until the hero, the audience, can't ignore him anymore. Death is not terrifying because he kills. He's terrifying because he's present, and he's honest, because he doesn't even blink at anything that changes, and because eventually he's right. Maybe that's why this villain stays with us. Not because he's evil, but because he asks us to take life seriously. This has been Narrative Autopsy. Until we meet again.